Starfield is here on PC with a lot of questions about how it looks, runs, and what issues there may be. And that is what this video is going to be about today. Xbox Series X comparisons, DLSS mod discussion, my optimized settings, a breakdown of the CPU load in the game, and a discussion about the differences in performance across competing graphics cards. That's a lot to say, but before I start in the game menu, as I always tend to, I need to say something about this video to kind of set the mood. My icebreaker in this video is that while I may critique a number of aspects of this PC version with varying levels of harshness, regardless of these critiques, the PC version of this game is indeed the best way to play it, full stop. So all my critiques need to be seen through that lens. The game is eminently playable on all platforms, as John and Oliver have already said in their videos. And on PC, it's even more so the case due to higher performance potential and user configurability. But nonetheless, there are issues here in this PC version that need addressing to make the game better. An example of this nuance is that Starfield's graphical options and user experience have aspects which are good, mediocre, and it's even bad in some areas. It's good in the aspect of shader compilation stutter. The game has a rather quick shader compilation step when the game starts up that, in my gameplay experience, seems to work well. No new effects on screen triggered obvious shader compilation stutter. That does not mean, of course, that all stutter is gone, and that's something I will talk about towards the end of the video, but shader compilation appears to work well, and it is a good example of good user experience in this game. An example of mediocre user experience is found in the game's graphical settings menu. The settings are useful, as we will find out later in the video with my optimized settings analysis, but that can only be really well discerned with a scientific back and forth testing with recordings like what we do at Digital Foundry. Regular players don't analyze a game like Digital Foundry, and the options menu is not helping them get a good experience in this game. There is no preview image or real-time settings preview to get you, the player, to understand visually what each setting is going to do. There's no good way of understanding here, based on those descriptions, what may happen when you change a setting, and there's no indication about what type of performance impact there might be. For such a huge game, from such a wealthy studio and publisher, the lack of information in the graphical options is a large blemish, and most players won't have any idea what settings they should change to get a good experience on PC. The biggest blemish, though, is the lack of basic options. There is no field of view option in a first-person game. I can barely believe that. I mean, I was feeling nauseous at times while playing this game on PC due to the default claustrophobic FOV. PC games need FOV sliders, especially for first-person games. Always. It's an accessibility issue, and players shouldn't have to resort to config file tweaks or mods to change the field of view. And yes, you can find out how to do that online very easily. Similarly, there's no anisotropic filtering option. The game has weirdly poor texture filtering at times, even at the highest settings. So why is there no option to tweak that in-game? Another issue is that forcing it in the control panel can show strange bugs with the shadows at times, so I can't necessarily recommend forcing it in the control panel to fix the issue. Now, as many in the audience know, Bethesda games are prized for their modding and modability, but the ability to go out of the menu and invest in online mods or out-of-game tweaks to make the experience better is actually a problem on Starfield and PC, as mods are covering basic user experience essentials. FOV falls under this category, as does high dynamic range rendering. The game just doesn't natively support HDR on PC at all, even though it does on Xbox. And even then, the game's SDR grading, which is used for auto HDR, for example, is really bizarre. Most scenes in the game look gray, and they lack much, if any, contrast. If you're gaming on an OLED display, for example, this game looks pretty bad, I would say, in terms of color reproduction. Modders are looking to fix color grading by changing the LUTs in the game, and other modders are working to get real HDR working here. Once again, though, modders are kind of doing basic legwork for things that should be tweakable in the game by default. Then there's the most controversial aspect of modders having to work here in this game to get the game better at launch, and that is by adding in DLSS and XeSS. Back in the beginning of the year, I made a PC port manifesto video where I described how AAA games, aka those that have a lot of money invested into them, should support all vendor upscalers to ensure a great experience across all hardware, because it is indeed a pittance for QA, and engineering time. There are a number of good developers on record stating that adding in one of the techniques for image reconstruction means adding in the other techniques is a really easy thing to do. Yet at launch, there is no DLSS or XeSS in Starfield on PC. Within hours of the game launching though, modders had already added in DLSS and XeSS, and I opted to use the FSR2 bridge mod that exists to show off what DLSS adds to the experience. And boy oh boy, based on the number of downloads of those DLSS and XeSS mods and the visual impact on display, there's quite a situation on hand here. To put it simply, people want DLSS or XeSS in a game like this to make sure the game looks and runs best on their hardware, and FSR2, in spite of its cross-vendor compatibility, is just not what people want universally. And there are good objective quality reasons for FSR2 not being a best fit for every bit of hardware out there. There are a lot of areas in the game where FSR2 kind of just falls apart and has issues, and I can show that by means of comparison, as DLSS does not have these issues. FSR2, for example, ghosts on all particle effect types. You can see that, for example, with this flame effect here. FSR2 has plain to see multiple frame ghosting on any opaque object that moves rapidly. A good example can be seen just by changing your weapon. You can see a ghosted apparition of your gun in the frames after changing your weapon with FSR2, but that's not visible in DLSS. Or you can fire your weapon. The shell casings in the game universally ghost with FSR2 in a big way, regardless of quality mode. That's something that doesn't happen with DLSS. Characters or objects that move across the screen with FSR2 have visible ghosting and disocclusion fizzle on and around them. This doesn't really happen with DLSS at the same quality levels. And in general, in the game, any sort of neon effect or thin geometry will flicker and alias with FSR2. And this is obvious in the area of the game called Neon, for example, where there's a lot of signage there, and it has full-on flickering with FSR2 that just doesn't happen with DLSS. Now, the issues I'm mentioning with FSR2 here happen at any quality level or any resolution. These are resolution agnostic issues that I'm talking about. It will happen with quality mode with its 67% internal axis scaling, just as it will happen in performance mode. So those are the issues you can have in the game with FSR2, and those are the easy ones to see. So people are going to mod in DLSS or XeSS to get around those issues. And people are also going to mod in DLSS because it has greater user utility. I'll talk about it later, but this game is heavy on GPUs, and DLSS, for example, will scale more gracefully to lower quality levels. So if you want to play the game at 1080p with DLSS, you can do that. And DLSS will offer a relatively flicker-free experience without ghosting. The same can't be said for FSR2 though, which is not as good at these lower resolutions. So DLSS mods can enable more players to get a better visual experience in the game than the default options. Now, all what I just said about DLSS may sound like a litany here, but I think it needs to be plainly said. It's important to support all vendor image reconstruction techniques for really big AAA games. And I say this all without going into depth about DLSS 3 frame generation. As far as I see it, Starfield's graphical menu is subpar and per default relies too much on the community to make up for its obvious shortcomings. It's nice that the community does these things, and I highly recommend anyone in the audience to go to Nexus Mods and check out what you can find there. But really, this game should support basic things like DLSS, field of view, HDR, and anisotropic filtering out of the box in the year 2023.
Now that was some fine work on the pressure.
So how does PC compare to Xbox Series X? Well, one of the first differences on PC is the ability to have much faster loading. Loading the same save on Xbox Series X versus a Core i9-12900K and a PCIe Gen 4 NVMe shows that the game loads in less than a third of the time on that PC. So if your kit is up to snuff like this one is, you can skip nearly all of that long waiting that is seen in the Xbox Series X version of the game, leading to a much snappier experience. But how does the game compare graphically? This is a great question here, as the game is very heavy on the GPU. If I load the game up on a RTX 2070 Super, a similar GPU class of hardware to that found in the Xbox Series X, but I would say a bit slower, of course. If I play at the ultra settings at 4K with FSR2 with a similar internal resolution to the Xbox Series X, we can see that that is completely off the table. It is mainly sub 30 FPS in the mid 20s. So obviously Xbox Series X is not going to be running ultra settings here. And getting to the bottom of what settings it is possibly using is a great way to understand how to optimize the PC version. So let us start with grass quality. Here the Xbox Series X does not use ultra or high, but rather it uses medium. That is visible by looking at the amount of grass instances being drawn at a distance here. This is a smart move for optimization, as reducing grass quality, for example on an RTX 2070 Super at 1440p FSR2 balance mode, which is 59% axis scale, that increases performance by 15%, where grass is primarily in view and nothing else. And honestly, it's pretty hard to tell medium from ultra at a normal view distance when not looking from above. Volumetric lighting is like foliage, and on Xbox Series X, the level being used is closest to PC's medium. And we can see that by the shape, size, and frequency of artifacting in this shot here. The flicker and pixelization line up rather perfectly with PC's medium setting. Unsurprisingly, this is a smart optimization. An RTX 2070 Super sees a 7% performance uplift by dropping to medium here in this scene, which appears to be an inflection point for performance, and high barely is different than ultra. So definitely use that as an optimized setting. Another medium setting on Xbox Series X is reflections, which is visible in the quality and detail visible in the game's cube maps when you smash your face right up into them. On PC, I would also recommend the medium setting for mid-range GPUs, as it can offer an 8% performance benefit with little visual difference at most camera ranges from the cube maps, like you can see in this shot here. Forget not, the reflections in this game are generated in real time, so they are expensive to draw. Other settings on Xbox Series X are less clean cut to the PC presets. Contact shadows, for example, controls screen space shadows, and here the shape and coverage is most similar to PC's medium, but we can see it artifacting and flickering more than the PC version, even at a similar internal resolution. So somehow it is worse than PC medium. On PC, I would recommend medium here, as it offers a little bit of performance with minimal visual differences. Shadows do not also line up with PC perfectly. Based on the resolution of a distant cascade, the Xbox Series X looks like the Ultra setting. Notice how the cascade stays the same resolution here on the building on Xbox instead of fading to a lower quality like we can see on high, medium, or low. But close range shadows, as we see here, shows that Xbox Series X is using a custom shadow setting, as closer shadow cascades have the same resolution actually as low shadows on PC. With this custom setting in mind, I actually recommend the medium setting on PC, as it ups performance massively by around 40% here in this shot on the 2070 Super. And it also doesn't look too bad next to Ultra and looks nearly the same as high. High, though, would also not be a bad choice for performance reasons. Another setting not lining up with PC is VRS, or variable rate shading. It is indeed on Xbox Series X, as we can see here, where this texture with VRS on, as we see in the middle, shows smudges in some of the finer distinctions in that texture detail that I'm highlighting here. But it's honestly a rather fine-grained difference. It's hard to notice at all on PC. Xbox Series X, though, as we can see here, actually has more degradation than PC's VRS. There are blocks of variable rate shading here that do not appear on PC on an NVIDIA graphics card. So VRS appears to be slightly more aggressive on Series X. Whether you should turn it on PC is an interesting question. At 1440p FSR2 balanced, I just saw a 0.4% performance increase. When using Xbox Series X like 4K output with FSR2 in quality mode, that increased to a 0.7% performance increase with VRS on. I say leave on VRS for a minor performance boost with a near invisible quality loss. GTAO is up next, and when going from ultra to low on PC, turning that setting down, we can see it lightens up the ambient occlusion in the corners, making its coverage more subtle. On Xbox Series X, GTAO is even lighter than PC's low, with less coverage even at the same internal resolution. So I would say it appears to be lower than low. Here I recommend the medium setting on PC, as it offers a near 3% performance improvement, but unlike low, it will not flicker as much in movement. And this is especially true if you're using FSR2, which will flicker in its own right anyway with that low GTAO setting. Particle quality affects the resolution of lighting on particles, and here medium and high look practically the same to my eye. Low, though, noticeably degrades the resolution of shadows drawn across billboard particles, making them alias with bigger, blurrier blocks. XSX here looks to be either medium or high, which look the same, and for optimized settings, medium and high perform the same. and I actually do recommend medium or high for optimized settings here, as I find low a bit too degraded. Now motion blur. Based upon the amount of artifacting and aliasing seen when motion blur is paused, it appears to be the low setting on Xbox Series X, which honestly is not easy to see in motion, even at 30 FPS. So if you want to use motion blur, I would say low is an optimized setting. The last two settings I was less certain of on Xbox Series X. Indirect lighting is most likely not the low setting, as the low setting can sometimes show obvious lower resolution aspects not seen in the other settings, like we can see on this grating here. I would also say Xbox Series X does not use the ultra setting, as that changes the appearance of distant specular objects at times, like we can see on the far right here, making this window at a distance brighter than all the other settings and Xbox Series X. So Xbox Series X is maybe medium or high, and I cannot really tell them apart. For optimized settings, I measured indirect lighting running the exact same between medium and ultra. It only ran slightly better on low. For me, I think you can really use any setting here, and you can even elect to use ultra. The crowd setting is also another mystery setting to me. All of the settings on PC and Xbox Series X show a very similar amount of NPCs on screen, and believe me, I counted them. And this was done after loading up the game save after a game restart on all platforms. So I'm not exactly sure where the difference is here in visuals for this setting. For optimized settings in this one, I found that the low setting technically offered a 3% performance increase over the course of an entire run through Aquila in the NPC filled areas there. And this was while being CPU limited on a Ryzen 5 3600. So the setting can maybe technically help performance, assuming that is what I actually measured there, but I'm not fully convinced of it. Low is technically the optimized setting here for CPU limited configurations, but honestly you wouldn't be wrong if you went with high either. And there you have it. Optimized settings look like this, very close to what Xbox Series X is doing, as Xbox Series X is taking a good approach here. Most settings it adjusts do not dramatically negatively affect image quality while offering tangible performance benefits. Since this game doesn't have ray tracing, the game's highest settings definitely have issues with diminishing returns for the performance you pay for them. Altogether, while running through a scene like this one here, using optimized settings on the RTX 2070 Super at 1440p and FSR2 balance mode with 59% internal resolution saw a 45% performance improvement on average while moving, which was really nice to see. But I would say it is a bit flickery and blurry with FSR2. With DLSS injected via a mod, the game looks a good deal better, I would say, in that same area and runs 3% better than FSR2. The last bit to cover for optimized settings here is dynamic resolution scaling, or DRS, as it's available in the options menu at the top, but unfortunately I have to report it is extremely limited for use. It does not work with the in-game VSync off, with any external frame rate limiters or driver VSync. It only works when your frame rate dips below 30, so you can't use it to target 60 or 120 FPS or anything. When below 30, it will dynamically adjust the resolution quite well to maintain the frame rate with VSync on. It functions exactly like it does on Xbox Series X then in that manner. But as you can see in the bottom right, with the frame time graph, having it on is not frame pacing the game correctly. The line is not smooth. That is because this game does not have a frame rate limiter in the menu that works. So this feature is not useful unless you are targeting 30 FPS with the in-game VSync on and do not mind improper frame pacing. A good version of this dynamic res in the menu would allow you to customize the target frame rate and have a good frame rate lock available separately. Now is the time where I talk a bit about general GPU performance, and reading comments online and from other outlets covering the game for its technology, I see a common theme, and that people generally see this game as being very GPU heavy for its visual output. I tend to agree with that sentiment. As an example, this walking area in Neon is supposed to be a populated part of that cyberpunk city, and with my optimized settings at 1440p FSR2 balance mode on the RTX 2070 Super, it runs at just a bit above 60 FPS. Do you think this looks right for the performance that you are seeing? In my mind's eye, I kind of want to say no, because I think of something like Cyberpunk 2077, where in similar scenarios, at my Alex's optimized settings with that same FSR2 balance mode at 1440p, well, I see a game there that looks similar in visual style and feature set for graphics, but it's running a good deal better on this 2070 Super than Starfield is. And these shots of Cyberpunk I'm showing here on the right also have ray traced local shadows enabled as well. So a game with ray tracing is running better than Starfield without ray tracing. While this comparison is completely subjective and really not even fair, I think it maybe does say, at least, that Starfield is perhaps spending its GPU resources in a way that has less visually obvious returns than other similar titles, hence the opinion that you read out on the web. Another part of that opinion of this game, that it is perhaps unoptimized on the GPU, is that there's a pretty big difference between the different card manufacturers in performance, and there's a lot of hard data for that. I first got wind of this from the great reporting by Daniel Owen, which showed how GPUs that usually perform similar to one another were actually performing radically different. Daniel saw, for example, in this scenario here, how the RX 7600 was outperforming the RTX 4060 by 40% at ultra settings. Such a difference is most definitely not the norm for rasterized titles, especially ones like this one, which are not even touching the VRAM. Digging into this rather large AMD advantage in this game, Daniel also highlighted something that I found interesting and that I was able to replicate at ultra settings at 1440p on the RX 6800 XT versus the RTX 3080. Here I found, much like Daniel, that there was a huge advantage on the AMD card. It's 46% faster than the RTX 3080. Another thing that I was able to replicate in my testing was something Daniel also noted. Take note of the frame time graph there on the RTX 3080. Notice how the frame times get really spiky when moving around. Daniel saw this same behavior in his testing. Frame times in this game are poorer on ultra settings on NVIDIA GPUs, and it gets worse the slower the GPU is. Ultra settings on that RTX 2070 Super that I showed off earlier, for example, show really big frame time spikiness there on the frame time graph, which are not at all there on the optimized settings that I have made for this game. In using optimized settings in a test, I found that the RX 6800 XT was still a good deal faster than the RTX 3080, 35% at native 1440p. But notice the 3080's frame times now. They're at least no longer spiky at these optimized settings. So what exactly is causing that spikiness on NVIDIA GPUs on Ultra? I went through each setting in a painstaking way and found that Ultra shadows specifically, apparently, at least in my test scene, causes a spikier frame time graph on the NVIDIA GPUs. In the footage you're seeing here, shadows are set to high while everything is still at ultra, and the frame time graph there with high shadows is a good deal better. So something about ultra shadows apparently in this game really dislikes NVIDIA GPUs. But regardless, as the ultra versus ultra settings show between the RX 6800 XT and the RTX 3080, AMD GPUs are really destroying NVIDIA ones in this game in a way that is just not seen normally in rasterized titles, really far out the norm. And given how 80% of the market or so has NVIDIA GPUs, it starts making sense collectively why people might have the impression that this game is unoptimized, because quite frankly it presents itself as being unoptimized in tests on NVIDIA GPUs in comparison to AMD ones. This is a rare exclusive AMD partner title, whatever that means, and I'd really not heard of that before Starfield. Without even being conspiratorial, I think it's reasonable to say that there's probably not a level playing field with regard to driver maturity and IHV path optimizations at launch here. That would just make sense. I would also imagine the same for an AMD card in a title like Portal RTX. Definitely not a level playing field in that game, hence why I complained about AMD GPU performance on launch for that title. Given the NVIDIA performance though here at launch, I would recommend NVIDIA users with slightly older mid-range GPUs like the RTX 3070 for example to wait it out a bit perhaps until NVIDIA brings out new drivers and Bethesda perhaps patches the game a bit to improve performance if possible. If you're on an Intel chip, then the situation is even worse, and I think it proves my point here about there not being a level playing field at the game's launch for drivers and IHV path optimization. First of all, the driver I had available as of getting access to the game could not even boot the game at all on an Intel Arc A770. And even with multiple emergency drivers since then from Intel, the game is still massively underperforming. An A770 is 15% slower than an RTX 2070 Super and 21% slower than a base RX 5700. As a reminder, the A770 is a good chunk faster than the base RX 5700 and DirectX 12 titles that have come into existence since ARC launched, and the RTX 2070 Super is pretty much always better than the 5700, full stop. So I would say performance and optimization is not correct here in Starfield at launch on NVIDIA and Intel GPUs. Okay, that is the GPU side of things. What about the CPU side? First, it needs to be said, like everyone else has said, the game is CPU heavy here. As I showed off earlier on the Ryzen 5 3600 in Aquila, the mid-range CPU is going to be limited in this game in cities and towns below 60 FPS. As you can see here, the game is sub 60 for nearly the entire walkthrough of Aquila, even at my optimized settings. As I walk through the town, I want you to notice the frame time graph too. As I hinted at the beginning of the video, the game doesn't have shader compilation stutter, but it does have traversal stutter that occurs in the exact same moments and times when you cross invisible lines in the game world, and it happens more often in the cities. This can be measured on the Ryzen 5 3600 as we're seeing here, but you can also see it on bigger CPUs like the Core i9-12900K, although it must be said that bigger and faster CPUs like the 12900K do reduce the size of the stutters, sometimes halving the frame time here in comparison to the Ryzen 5 3600. Not a big fan of those traversal stutters, to be honest. But getting back to that sub 60 FPS footage at optimized settings while CPU limited on the Ryzen 5 3600, I want to ask the question of, is this CPU performance justified? Looking at the CPU utilization statistics in the top right corner from RTSS, it does appear to be saturating this CPU specifically quite well with a lot of threads looking busy. But that's how it looks on the surface. Let's test how it actually scales. Checking out the game's core and thread scaling on a 12900K, I admittedly see some pretty worrying behavior here. For one, as in a number of games, E-cores do not bring anything to the table for performance. The game runs about 4% faster with E-cores off, and there's the exact same frame time stability. Another quick to see issue here on this Intel chip is that hyperthreading is performing worse in average frame rate than hyperthreading off with 8 P-cores on by a significant 12%. So hyperthreading on is performing worse than hyperthreading off. Checking that out more locally with 6 cores with hyperthreading on and off and 8 cores with hyperthreading on and off, we can see the behavior being reproduced again. 6 P-cores with hyperthreading enabled runs 8% slower on average than 6 P-cores with hyperthreading off. Now technically, the frame times at moments with just 6 P-cores with hyperthreading off were a little bit spikier looking on the frame time graph if you look down on the right, but that partially comes down to the fact that the base frame time was lower, making the hills and valleys of frame time differential, well, just being a little bit bigger in general. The delta is a bit higher. Still, on average, the appearance is that hyperthreading on Intel here is detrimental to performance to a degree when you get upwards of 6 cores, and definitely detrimental upwards of 8 cores. On AMD, this is not the case on the Ryzen 5 3600 at least. There, turning off SMT, as the feature is called there, reduces performance on average by around 5% in terms of average frame rate. But take a look at the frame times with hyperthreading off on the Ryzen 5 3600. They are so much spikier. Frame time health is a lot worse with SMT set to off on this AMD chip. So hyperthreading, or SMT as it is called on AMD chips, does provide a very substantial and noticeable performance boost here, at least on the Ryzen 5 3600, completely opposite of what we see on the 12900K. On the 12900K, frame times only started to get really rocky and bad when the chip only had 4 cores enabled, like we're seeing here on the far left. But if you look at the spread there of frame rates, average frame rates, the picture painted here on Intel specifically is not the best. If you compare Starfield to a game with more exemplary thread and core scaling like Cyberpunk 2077, then the issues that I am seeing become very clear. Notice how in this footage of Cyberpunk 2077, how each bit of the cores and threads added in this game from left to right show extremely clear benefits. The lines of the frame time graph and the frame rate graphs have big parallel intervals in between them. Performance is improving in a nice scaled way with more threads and cores being added to the game. In comparison, Starfield here is not scaling in a good way, and if I just put the numbers right next to each other, you can really see it. It is far from ideal. Performance at times, specifically on Intel, is actually regressing the more threads and cores that you add to the game. With that in mind, I would say on AMD, at least on this Ryzen 5 3600, the game seems to be scaling pretty well in a reasonable way that makes sense. It may change though when you go up the stack to more modern Ryzen CPUs with more cores and more threads there, but I did not have the opportunity to test them, and if you want to check out some stuff about that, I recommend going to Computer Base or other similar websites to see what the scaling is like there. So you finally made it to the end of my Starfield PC review. I could probably talk about more, but I really have covered a lot. Like I said at the beginning of the review, this game is best played on PC if you have modern components. But there are a good deal of issues here that will put a great experience out of the reach of too many PC players. For one, the options menu is not descriptive enough or does not show the user well how to get good settings. I was able to do that for you because I made literally hundreds of recordings and comparisons and spent hours looking over the data. It should be easier for a user to get optimized settings for themselves. They also need more basic things like FOV control, frame rate limiters, HDR, gamma and contrast controls, and of course DLSS and XeSS. As I said earlier, AAA titles with lots of money behind them should support every graphics vendor's reconstruction technique. For optimized settings, though, we did see that the settings that they do give you are indeed powerful if you could know how to use them. They're useful in improving performance. And I didn't really talk about it since it wasn't an issue at all, but this game is also very light on VRAM usage. 8GB cards should be more than fine for any resolution and settings level. Those optimized settings I did make, though, only go so far depending upon your GPU manufacturer. If you're on Intel and Nvidia, you're getting a bizarrely worse experience here in comparison to AMD GPUs, in a way that is completely out of the norm. I mean, seriously, look up nearly any other benchmark of any other rasterized game. There's no really good reason why an RTX 3080 should perform this much worse than an RX 6800 XT. That issue, combined with the poor core and thread scaling on the Intel chip I specifically measured here above 6 cores, shows me that this game is only partially optimized at launch. It seems optimized for AMD systems, but not so much so for Intel and Nvidia ones. So I would say Bethesda needs to do some work in optimizing better for those platforms. And Intel and Nvidia also need to put out some new drivers over time. And that is really all I have to say. If you did like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support DF on Patreon to get years of our videos in high quality for download. Other than that, comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.